Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Kelsey Squire, and I'm the director of the core program, and I'm also an associate professor of English. And since there's a panel of us today, I wanted to keep our introductions short so we can focus on hearing the remarks of all of the panelists. But up first, we will have Dr. Katie Gorman-Ezell, who is now at Capital University. She is the director, is that your title, of their new Master's in Social Work program. We have Emily Post-Phillips, who's an assistant professor of exercise science, and then Dr. Angel Stowe-Hunter, who is an associate professor of sociology. So Dr. Gorman-Ezell, if you want to take it away, we'll get started with you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time to come and hear us talk about how we can cope with the call for justice. And so I thought, for my part, it's going to be really important for us to all be on the same page when we're talking about definitions, right? So one of the things I wanted to talk about is social justice. What is social justice? Does anyone have any ideas as to what social justice may be? No? All right, well, that's okay, because I'm here to tell you. So social justice is the idea that we need to find justice in terms of distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. And that can look very different depending upon what we're talking about. So when we're talking about social justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, that could be something we're talking about within communities and schools, right? Do all students have access to what they need to be successful? Do they have the meals that they need? Do they have the technology that they need? Do they have the support that they need, right? That's one way we can look at wealth and how that's going to transition from one community to another. Because not all communities are equal, and unfortunately not all communities are given the same resources, right? And so that's part of our call to justice. How do we get to that level of equality and equity, right? Outside of talking about wealth, what about opportunity? Is everyone given the same opportunities in our societies? No. So we have to find a way to allow everyone to have equal access to opportunity in order to further themselves and their careers. And then when we're talking about privileges, right, there's certain groups who are more marginalized than other groups. And until those groups receive justice, it's going to be hard for them to reach their goals and aspirations the way they want them to. So, in order to talk about social justice, I think it's important for us to also understand the differences between equality, equity, and justice. And this cartoon, I think, does a really good example of depicting what we mean by these terms, right? And so the reality is we're all born in different places. In fact, I was walking the other day and I saw a t-shirt that said, some of us were born on third, yet think we hit a triple, right? So let that sink in for a moment. And so going with my baseball example, with it being the playoff times, the reality is in order for some of us to see what's going on in a baseball game, we need different ways to see, right? So there's one person who's on top of all those boxes who has a wonderful view, right? The next person can kind of peer over the fence. Their view is more distorted, right? Because they aren't privy to all of those boxes. And then the third person can't see it all, right? That's how oftentimes society functions, right? We're all born with different privileges. So when we talk about equality, the idea of equality is providing the same thing to every person, right? So when I think about equality, I think about the timing shortly after and during the pandemic, right? When schools provided breakfast and lunch to all students, regardless of income, regardless of location. All public schools were providing breakfast and lunch to all students. That's equality, right? Because everyone's getting the same thing. Just like in that picture, everybody gets one box. The problem is not everyone's the same height, right? Equity then is different from equality in that people are getting what they need, right? So some people are going to get more than other people are going to get, right? And so, for example, up here you see the person who couldn't see before now has 2 boxes, the other person has 1, and the other person is standing. At this point, they're all now at a level playing field, right? Because everybody has what they need in order to be able to see. Justice, and true justice, means that we don't have to worry so much about equality and equity because we're taking away all of the barriers. And once those barriers are gone, everybody can see. And everybody's able to see what they want to see, do what they want to do, and get what they want to get. So from my perspective, at least, we're working towards social justice. We're not there. We're barely at equality. We have a lot of equity to create in order for us to even begin talking or thinking about justice. And I think that one of the things that really stands out to me is the idea of privilege within society, right? And specifically, we've got to talk about white privilege. And so white privilege is the idea that white people, especially men, have privileges that others in America do not have just by virtue of being white, right? So let me kind of put this into a different context. As a white woman, if I need hair products, I have no problem walking into a store and finding those hair products, right? If I want to go shopping, people aren't going to follow me around and think I'm going to steal. If I am stopped by the police for speeding, chances are I can probably cry and get my way out of it. I don't know. Fortunately, knock on wood, that hasn't happened. But I don't have to worry that I'm going to get hurt or taken to jail because I was stopped by the police, just by virtue of the color of my skin. That is what white privilege is. And I think another quote I've always liked to think about is that privilege is also when you think something isn't a problem because it doesn't impact you, right? So think about everything going on in society, and sometimes we have the tendency to not really realize what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. And so for me, a lot of this idea of justice is what is justice and how can we start to really advocate and reform for social justice? And so as a social worker, that is really a calling within my profession. How do I advocate for marginalized populations? And what can I do to make the world a better place? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Phillips, and she's going to talk a little bit about justice and science.
We got a little bit of a height difference. Okay.
I'm the one who didn't read the box.
Yeah, I did. I also have a timer because if any of you have had me in class, you know I don't stop talking. So this will keep me a little bit accountable here. Okay, so you're probably thinking, why is there an exercise science professor on this panel? You're like, out of everything what anyone does, what is that? What does social justice have to do with you? And I recently had a conversation with an old colleague of mine, a white male, and one of the things he had said a little bit innocently was that he wished we could keep some of those DEI initiatives out of the sciences because they have nothing to do with us. And it's unfortunate, beyond unfortunate, but that's a really large part of the issue, right? So I'm gonna kind of set the stage. It's gonna be a little bit of a downer for this part, but I'm setting the stage for a lot of the mistrust in our medical system to kind of show where this is pertinent in the sciences in general. I am not here to speak for underrepresented populations, but just like everyone else, we're here to use our privilege in whatever way we can to advocate for underprivileged communities. So, starting off in the 18th century, we're going to go through each of the centuries and some of the just hallmark things that had happened to underrepresented communities. And so this is just a very small snippet. Keep in mind, there's way more than what I'm about to say here. So, in the 18th century, there was this term called scientific racism. This is obviously in enslaved periods, time periods, where their scientists came up with this term to essentially justify slavery. So it was a term that showed that people of color were genetically inferior and couldn't essentially take care of themselves in order to justify slavery. So obviously that's, a start of a huge issue. Then we continued on. There was general medical mistreatment of enslaved individuals. We know of a lot of mistreatment in general, but when you look at the medicine piece, a lot of the beginning gynecological advances were done on women of color without any sort of consent or anesthesia processes. So obviously a very big issue there. Operation procedures were practiced on people of color without any sort of general anesthesia or consent. So naturally, a very big issue to start in the beginning. There were also laws against interracial marriage, but not because people didn't like that, but more so of the actual scientific genetic component of it, of saying that any mixed race children would be inferior. And there was not good science, but there were scientists at the time that were attempting to prove that, to kind of solidify no interracial marriage in that as well. And then lastly, cadaver dissections. You're going to see this on about every slide. We had a lot of issues with this for several centuries before it was kind of taken under control. But it used to be enslaved individuals after death were dissected, obviously without consent. And grave robbing was a really big thing, typically robbing the graves of many people of color. Oops. 19th century. The surgical practice in medical schools, or in general physician practice, was continued. Same sort of thing as the last century, continued on. The dissection of black cadavers was rampant. It just ramped up in this time period, mainly because medical schools were ramping up. So as medical schools were ramping up, and as far as the cadaver dissection practices in medical schools, ramping up as well, grave robbing was insane. It was all the time. There were a couple instances of actual murdering of people of color to be able to use their bodies for dissections as well. So naturally, a lot of very big issues just on that one area alone. Executed criminals, there was an additional kind of embarrassing piece for those bodies to then be dissected and shown to the public afterwards. So then lastly, there was the kind of unclaimed bodies, which was a very big issue up until you'll see here in a little bit. That was where the majority of unclaimed bodies at the time were underrepresented communities, and they were also used for experimentation, cadaver dissections, and those sort of things. 20th century, this is where things kind of ramped up. This is where we get a lot of different medical practices ramping up. The other thing being that we didn't really have those things called IRBs, for ethics, that made sure that people were being protected and safe. So the Tuskegee study is one that I'm sure everyone in here has heard of. That was the syphilis study. There were over 600 black men that were recruited. 399 of them had syphilis. There was penicillin treatment at the time. They were not given treatment. That's the big unethical part of it. They were not given treatment. 28 men died by the end of it. It was a 40-year study. 28 men died. 100 died of complications that were related to syphilis, but the 28 were directly syphilis. 100 other died. 40 were passed on syphilis to their wives, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis due to that. So for a very big reason, this is a notable study. It was done by the CDC and Department of Health and Human Services, I believe was the other piece of it. And so that's the one that if you ask many underrepresented communities, this is the study a lot of people turn to, rightfully so. And then the next piece, Henrietta Lacks, this is an interesting piece because depending who you talk to in the sciences, they may look at this as a positive thing. Henrietta she was a 30-year-old who had passed away of a really severe form of cervical cancer. Her cells were shown to live on indefinitely, so without her consent prior, they used her cells as a new cell line to continue on. Now, that part is not completely abnormal. At the time, it was not common to get consent from individuals for their cells afterwards. The part that became an issue was in the 70s later on, whenever they began to research her family, where consent was at that point a thing that very much did happen, but there was no consent with her family there. Birth control programs were done primarily with women of color as they were considered inferior status genetically, and so the symptoms didn't matter. Those sort of things to individuals. So most of the experimentation was done there. Radiation experiments, many people of color had underwent radiation experiments without their knowledge. And prisoner experimentation, people were coerced into research for whatever sort of incentives. Most people in the prison system were minorities, and so they were coerced and in experimentation research that was detrimental research. And then this next one, this is the one that kind of gets me a little bit, is there was an aggression research. So this was a study that involved recruiting young Black boys, and the parents were recruited as well through monetary devices mostly. They were typically, or most of them were lower income as well, so they had a really extreme monetary incentive to participate. The children were not taken away, they were kind of handed over to the researchers and stayed overnight. They were withdrawn from water for a while. They had hourly blood draws. They were taken off all medication, even like asthma medication and necessary medication. And the interesting part is they were given phenethylamine, which is basically, at the time, it was shown to have, it was a serotonin boosting drug that was shown to have relations with aggression. And so this study naturally found that these boys were aggressive, but they were given a pharmaceutical that was essentially shown to do that. So it perpetuated the idea that Black men and boys were aggressive in nature. And then lastly, once again, the cadaver piece. This was still an issue with unclaimed bodies for a while until the Uniformity Anatomy Act of 1968. So this is basically where it came into play, of where you had to give consent prior to passing of donating your body to science. This is now into, kind of where we are now. This is mostly to show that this hasn't stopped. This is still readily ongoing, and there's a reason there's a mistrust in a lot of our medical system. In 2019, there was a computer algorithm that anyone who self-identified as Black or African American had received lower health risk scores, which means that they received lower health referrals, which means they typically received a lesser quality of health care. I'm going to skip down to 2022 because this was pretty much all of this 21st century. There were race correction medical devices, so just not every medical device, but quite a few medical devices that were calibrated, and the control was set to white population. So every single correction factor was done standard to the white population. 2019, there's this researcher called Pesta, that's his last name. He's a hereditarian researcher. He primarily focuses in genetics, and what that means is that we basically can, the hereditarian position is that genetics make up our behavior, and there's not as much of a social science aspect to it. It's more of that kind of nature versus nurture, primarily being in that nature piece. And so his group, when you work with NIH data, you have to apply with very specific practices of what you're going to do with the data. So he applied 8 different times. One finally got approved. He used the data, manipulated it, and didn't, used it illegally, essentially. And at that point, what he kind of came up with was, and he was found of misuse in 2021, what he came up with was essentially that Black individuals were inferior genetically due to, or the IQ was inferior genetically due, the IQ was inferior due to genetics. And he talks about how he believes that race is as a social contract, but then when you actually look at his research and what he's published a lot, it's all still out there. That's not what it says. So there's that piece. And then lastly, we all know how there's been a disproportionate impact of COVID. So when that comes to the Black population has double the mortality rate. The Latin population has about a third more mortality rate compared to the white counterparts. A lot of that has to do with, we know, healthcare access, those sort of pieces with that. So there are also a couple other things I wanted to include here, being some of this medical mistrust. There are some myths for minority groups or underrepresented populations, being that like a higher pain tolerance, there's a lack of cultural diversity, competence, empathy in general. With that kind of pain tolerance piece, there are a lot of people that have been shown to have lesser care in a sense of less pain medication and those sort of things due to the perception of higher pain tolerance. The other thing is textbooks in medical school learning underrepresentation. When I was teaching, actually PA anatomy, I was looking for a medical textbook that had full representation in it. There isn't one. There still isn't one now. The good thing is there are several publishers who are working towards that. They're getting there. And that's the positive thing with some of this that we see is we see a lot of negative here, taking you through the history, right? But there are some positives coming from this. There are some textbooks that are coming out that fully represent people of color with everything as well. The next piece I want to touch on was transgender-related health equity. So some of the common things that are studied are more psychiatric diagnosis, sexual or gender affirmation procedures, et cetera. But a couple of things that aren't studied really at all are cancer and cardiovascular disease, even though we know there could potentially be a pretty high link with long-term hormone use in those areas. And then the mental health aspect of one of the studies that I found was a more recent study in 2019, I believe, that 82% of transgender individuals have considered suicide and over 40% have attempted suicide. And so obviously a very big mental health problem there as well that needs to be further researched. And then lastly, it's hard to research something when we have prohibitive laws, medical laws within that. And so that's the other kind of piece that there's less research due to some of the strict medical laws in the last couple of years. And there's a pretty extensive, obviously, prejudice, stigma, discrimination, and transphobia against transgender individuals. This piece, Katie actually touched on it a little bit here. When it comes to exercise and nutrition, there's this kind of mentality of, well, if you want to be healthy, just exercise, just eat healthy. It's not that hard. And we all know that's not true. So for the majority of individuals, there are food deserts. So do people have access to nutrient-dense foods? A lot? No. Safety considerations. Someone who works a mid-shift who comes home and maybe wants to take a walk outside, but can't because they live in a pretty unsafe neighborhood where it's not safe to walk alone. The walkability in general, a lot of these are impacting low-income communities more than anything else. Then we have the physical activity guidelines basis. So obviously this is a little bit more of my area, but the bias here is all of our guidelines are 100% based on the white population. And so we need more research that looks a little bit more into like cultural differences, physical activity preferences. There's a lot of that just is completely glossed over in pretty much all of our exercise guidelines. Lastly, environmental inequities. We know that many low-income communities and many underrepresented communities have less access to like clean water, to clean air, those sort of things. And even though we have laws that prevent or are supposed to prevent a lot of that, they're not really enforced. So that's still another very large issue. Our field is, all the sciences are primarily white-dominated field. The only place you really see a kind of upper projection of women is in that healthcare, specifically in the nursing field. All of the rest of those STEM fields, you really don't see a lot of diversity in both race and gender there. And then my last slide. So I thought this was important to bring up to show that we're still struggling. We're still there. So in 2019, there was a study that about 9% of the STEM jobs were made up of Black individuals. So obviously a very low percentage. And then a second one, when we looked at gender and race barriers to success, this is important because it's specific to the STEM field. So 50% of women in the STEM fields face gender discrimination compared to 41% outside of the STEM fields. And then when you look, 62% of African Americans in STEM encountered discrimination compared to 50% in the non-STEM fields. You also look at Nobel Prize, we've had 16 awarded to Black recipients, but not one Black scientist has ever been awarded to the majority of sciences, chemistry, physics, physiology, or medicine, and not for lack of opportunity as far as we have researchers available for those sort of things. And so even though a lot of what I just talked about is a bit of a downer, I'm handing it off to Dr. Sohunter, who will be able to kind of give us a little bit more of those coping tools. So I had the down part, and then we'll kind of move on to maybe a little bit more of an upper.
This may be the only venue where I am the upper, so happy to be that. I want to talk to you today about coping with social justice in the context of a college professor. So many of us in this audience, that is where we do a lot of our social justice work. That is a context that is incredibly rewarding and a context that is incredibly punishing. When you combine that context with a discipline and topics that are primarily negative and focused on the issues within society, you can see why Coping for the Call for Justice is the title that we chose for today and why it's relevant to myself as a sociology professor. So rather than share my own personal coping strategies, some of which we probably should not emulate, I want to talk to you a little bit about how we can transform our pedagogy and curriculum to better cope with social justice, or our call for social justice. Oops, wrong way. There we go. I'm a huge fan of C.W. Mills and the sociological imagination. Anybody in my class, shout out. I see you guys. Thanks for coming. We spend a lot of time in class talking about how sociology is simultaneously terrible and magnificent. And that's a quote that comes directly from Mills. And I actually take a lot of pride in showing my wide-eyed freshmen all of the social ills that exist and really emphasizing the terrible. But I was struck by all the ways that we miss opportunities to amplify the magnificent in our sociology classes. So it's from that perspective that I want to look at and examine. First question, do we only teach about the terrible? Unfortunately, this lesson in the terrible does not just end in my intro to social class. Most of our sociology curriculum is actually quite terrible, and I listed some of the topics that we teach about. Not happy. We are definitely not your feel-good discipline. I will emphasize this is not unique to Ohio Dominican Sociology Department. This is sociology everywhere. And in fact, in her 2015 NCSA presidential speech, Lisa Yogan actually laments both a deficit's approach to social justice and this overemphasis on social problems. She became aware of a term, sociological depression, and I think that kind of fits with what we're talking about today. And she describes this as the result of being immersed in the world of social problems, especially when those problems seem overwhelming, intractable, and rife with conflict. I actually had my own kind of aha moment in relation to sociological depression at our last senior oral exam. One of our graduating seniors said that one of the things she learned over the past couple of years was that she could only take 1 or 2 sociology classes per semester. And I said, why? And her answer was, I honestly get a little bit too depressed if I am talking about that all the time. So really seeing that sociological depression in play. So how does one cope with sociological depression? And more importantly, how can we actually teach in a way that shows our students not only the terrible, but the magnificent? And I want to return to Lisa Yogan's work and talk about this idea of positive sociology. Oops, sorry. Positive sociology is defined this way. It is the study of what people do to organize their lives such that those lives become, in combination, substantially rewarding, satisfying, and fulfilling. Yogan sees positive sociology as not simply a course, but a new way of thinking about our curriculum and our pedagogy. Her ideas begin with the notion that there are elements of our culture and society known to promote individual, group, and societal flourishing. Why are we not spending more time teaching about those aspects of society? In sociology, that might include things like positive deviance, social solidarity, and yes, even kindness. These are the magnificent elements that we already offer in our core curriculum. We literally have a course, 279, that teaches students about what it means to focus on conditions that allow for human flourishing, that which makes life worth living. This is also the magnificent that provides students a counter to the gloom and doom inherent in the challenges that we are preparing them to face. And I want to argue that this is the magnificent that actually can encourage professors struggling to cope with the call for justice. So my next question is, do our classrooms reflect the goals that we have for our students? So we know that ODU is a mission-centric university, and our mission is to educate students to be what? Not millionaires, although that would be lovely, but for the most part, we're focusing on ethical, serving, competent, in a global society, leaders pursuing truth, justice, and peace. And surely there are many of us who embody this mission in our classroom in a variety of ways. And I love the diversity of pedagogy and curriculum that we offer. So I'm not here to tell you how to teach. In fact, most of you in this room have actually taught me how to teach. But what I do want to do is return to Yogan's call for positive sociology. And she draws on the work of Peter Benson to highlight characteristics of what she terms a thriving classroom. And I have 4 of those listed up there: generosity, kindness, connection, and engagement. She urges us to see students as fundamentally good people, but also as fragile human beings. To be generous with our resources, especially our time, to look for opportunities to connect our students to each other, and to invite students to join in our joy for our subject matter. Now, obviously, many of us are already doing this in our classroom. But do we ever pause to realize that this is not the norm across all college classrooms? That indeed our work is distinct and relevant and an act of social justice. Yogan shares a quote from Peter Benson that I will share with you as well. Students are not, I think I have the quote. Oh, it's up there, sorry. Students are not vessels to be filled, but flames to be lit. Perhaps Benson, too, was influenced by Catherine of Siena. When we're lighting our students' flames, rather than merely filling their vessels, coping with a call for justice becomes much easier for both professors and students. We've all had those, "Oh, Captain, my Captain" moments. Shout out to Dr. Brick. Those moments, for those of you who haven't seen Dead Poets Society, that's the reference. Those moments when we see the light in our students' eyes and all the long nights and painful faculty meetings, if we had those here, fade away. So perhaps coping with our call for justice as educators occurs as we remind ourselves and each other to be courageous enough to create classrooms that reflect our goals, to share with each other the joy that comes when we see our students on fire. My final question, what about love, emerges from an early memory at Ohio Dominican. My first year here, I had the privilege of sharing an office with the now somewhat legendary Dr. Barrett and Sister Roberta, who sometimes is here, but I don't see her today. To be honest, it was quite the mix of feminist quotes, motorcycle magnets, and a few what I describe as nun-like pictures. It was that semester that Dr. Barron told me she was teaching a course called The Sociology of Love. I was intrigued. So I said, "Do you mean sexuality or marriage and family?" Those were courses I was familiar with. She looked at me and said, "No, I mean love." And then she said something that has stuck with me for 10 years. What is sociology if it isn't love? I don't really remember what happened next. I assume she fluttered off or resumed playing some Mozart. But her comment, "What is sociology if it isn't love?" struck me. As a new professor, fresh out of graduate school, I was too embarrassed to tell her I have no idea what you're talking about. And I was more prepared to talk about things like multiple regression, R-squared, and model fit. These were topics that I had learned in graduate school. Love was not. Now, please don't hear me if you want to talk about stats. I would enjoy that conversation too. But my graduate education in many ways had led me to reduce humans to measurable variables and social problems to statistical puzzles. Now here I am, 10 years later, a little older, maybe a little wiser, definitely less afraid to admit when I don't understand something. And I'm returning to this idea of sociology as love, to the notion that students should not only walk away from our classes understanding all that is wrong with society, but also be empowered and compelled to love those most impacted by these problems. I'm not talking about a mushy, feely love. I am still a scientist, but an altruistic love that sees the struggling individual, community, and society as not just a problem to be fixed, but as complex systems with strengths and weaknesses. A love that sees assets
not just deficits, and comes alongside rather than powers over those whom our students will ethically serve and lead. So to conclude, I'm quite fond of Dr. Carson's definition of justice. He says it frequently, and I like it: a right relationship with self, others, and the divine. I want to argue that given this definition, is there not a part of working for justice in the classroom that demands we amplify the magnificent, create thriving classrooms, and do all of this with love? And maybe in doing so, we might not only be able to cope with our call to justice, but also thrive in our social justice work here.
Need those boxes, right? All right, so again, my name is Dr. Kelsey Squire, and today I'm going to conclude our panel by considering how justice intersects with the practice of literature and the arts. In thinking about this topic, I wanted to consider two different areas. First of all, what does it mean to do justice to a work of art itself? And what are some of the encounters with injustice that we face in this field? Since these are pretty big topics, I wanted to just focus on one author for our time today to be a touchstone for some of these issues. In some of my research on justice in literature, the science fiction writer Octavia E. Butler's name comes up quite frequently and in some unexpected places, and so I'm going to use her as that touchstone today. So first, I want us to consider this question of what does it mean to do justice to a particular artistic practice. Part of my interest in this question was inspired by a sociologist whose name is Mark Banks, and he has a book titled Creative Justice: Cultural Industries, Work, and Inequality. In this book, Banks asks us to consider what does it mean to do justice to a work of art? How can we respect the history and traditions of various artistic modes and genres? How do we practice artistic forms with integrity and vision? Banks argues that to do justice to art involves consideration of cultural work as a source of not just an economic value, but also as a social value as well as an aesthetic one. For Octavia Butler, justice to art itself meant defending her choice to work in the genre of science fiction. In a 1994 interview with Jelani Cobb, Butler explained that how for the first 3 decades of her career, many people questioned why a Black woman would want to write science fiction. And if you work in the arts and cultural industry, you get questions about why would you do that all the time. So some of the questions that she faced were things like, why are you writing science fiction? Why would you write something so unreal? Why don't you write something that would be meaningful? Butler would respond in this way: what's good is science fiction thinking about the present, the future, and the past. What's good is its tendency to warn or to consider alternative ways of thinking and doing. What is good is its examination of the possible effects of science and technology, or social organization and political direction. At its best, science fiction stimulates imagination and creativity. It gets the reader and the writer off the beaten track, off the narrow footpath of what everyone is saying and doing and thinking, whomever everyone happens to be that year. In his interviews with working artists, specifically he was working in this time with jazz musicians, Banks found that while there are some external rewards to an artistic life, money, fame, status, many artists are strongly motivated by the internal rewards of practice. As Banks argues, in the arts, this sense of practice is not necessarily individualistic, but rather a collective recognition and regard for the standards of worth inherent in an activity. Banks describes some of his work with these musicians who frequently cited the internal rewards of learning, being taught, and teaching as part of doing justice to their artistic practice, of trying to meet and exceed standards of excellence. In her interviews and personal essays, Octavia Butler repeatedly offered advice to young writers on how to sustain such a practice. Some of her rules for practice include read about the art, the craft, and the business of writing. Read the kind of work you'd like to write. Read good literature and bad, fiction and fact. Read every day and learn from what you read. She encourages people to take classes and go to writers' workshops. Writing is communication. You need other people to let you know whether you're communicating what you think you are and whether you're doing it in ways that are not only accessible and entertaining, but as compelling as you can make them. And of course, she says, write every day, write whether you feel like writing or not. As tempted as I am to go on and read her entire essay, she has more advice. I think that this sample highlights how writers do justice to practice by immersing themselves in their craft. Butler stresses that writers continually evolve and deepen their understanding of their craft of literature through reading, writing, and community. Artists and writers encounter injustice, though, in these communities, and I'm going to look at two primary ways today. First, many feel called to address injustice through their artistic practice. They may willingly expose themselves to exploring their experiences or their community's experiences of inequality, violence, and discrimination in their works. One of the things that helps is having a clear sense about your views on humanity and your artistic craft. In a 1998 interview, Butler explained that to her, humans don't fit into binary categories. She says, there are a lot of people, unfortunately, some of them are writers and editors, who see things in strictly terms of good and evil. The aliens either come to help us get our poor heads straightened out, or they come to destroy us. What I hope to wind up with in my work are a series of shadings that correspond to the way that concepts like good and evil enter into the real world. Never absolute, always by degrees. Another set of injustices that artists encounter can be within the very systems that attempt to promote and encourage artistic work. As Banks writes in Creative Justice, many believe that art is a meritocracy, that those who are the most talented will be rewarded with scholarships, publications, exhibitions, money, and fame. Doing justice, Banks argues, means that we need to examine institutions closely for the ways in which they can reinforce and in some cases create injustice. For example, some individuals and organizations prey on new artists and writers, exploiting their vulnerability. Octavia Butler frequently recalls the sting of getting scammed. She paid an agent a $60 reading fee, and this was in the 60s, so that was quite a bit of money for her and her family, in order to secure publication for her work that never happened. As Linnell George illustrates in her work, A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, Butler struggled to balance her writing career with her need to earn a living. She kept countless lists and ledgers, tracking her expenses, trying to survive. And it's difficult, you can't see it very well on here, but it's a grocery list out there where she's writing down the price of everything in the margins. As Mark Banks argues, the creative economy is not only failing to provide the conditions that would allow ordinary people to enter the labor market and participate in the construction of culture, but also actively exacerbating social inequalities in that work through its own structures and patterns of organization. So one of the first steps to mitigating injustice at an institutional level is to start with some raw data. So for example, many people in the field of English often teach and learn that starting in the late half of the 20th century, especially in the 1980s, publishers began publishing a ton of books by African American authors and people of color. In Redlining Culture, A Data History of Racial Inequality in Post-War Fiction, Richard Jean So looks at actual data from publishers, which is actually really hard to get, and he finds that consistently during this era, about 98% of books published were by white authors, which you can see the white authors are that line at the top, and then everybody else is that line at the bottom down there. In the summer of 2020, authors used the hashtag #PublishingPaidMe to crowdsource data about publishing advances in the hopes that this information could provide writers of color information about their field for negotiations. Also in 2020, artist Alexis Clements started the Answer Is No podcast with the tagline of "Stories of artists saying no to bad gigs so they can say yes to good ones." Each of these examples points out how gathering data on the arts can help us to identify the ways in which we can question some of the mythologies surrounding work in the arts and find new ways of collective action. Of course, math is typically not an artist's strong suit, although here I'll make an important plug for a liberal arts education and interdisciplinary studies. So to conclude here, the path forward might also require new metaphors, which is something that artists are very good at, new ways of seeing. So for example, in the recent book, Viral Justice, How to Grow the World We Want, author Ruha Benjamin suggests that the study of the alienated species can provide us with alternative modes of survival and change. We're living in a hostile environment. What can we learn from the things that survive and thrive? Benjamin argues that, quote, "At the end of the day, I am a student of the late, great Octavia E. Butler, writer and builder of speculative worlds. To the question, what is there to do? She once responded, I think there's no single answer to that question that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers, at least. You can be one of them if you choose to be. Those who engage in the practice of art and literature can be the ones to help us sort through some of those answers, both as we reckon with our past and try to imagine a more just future." Thank you so much. And now we'll have some time for questions. So I'll open it up to the audience here and see if anyone has questions to start us off, or I have some that we can get the panel started with as well. Yeah, Julie.
Each of your presentations were great, and I think could have stood alone for a full hour-long presentation and questions and answers. My question is, was it easier to say yes to being on a panel? Would you have said yes as easily to participating if you would have had a full hour?
Oh, that's a great question. Anyone want to tackle it? Sure, I can repeat the question. So Julie was saying that any one of these talks could have been an hour on its own. And so she's wondering why we said yes to a panel, or if that was an easier decision for us to do this format. So Emily, do you want to take it?
I talk a lot, so I could have said yes, I think, just to an hour. It would have been, I think I would say yes, because then I would also get to talk about within the last 5 years, some of the changes in medicine, positive move forward, and get to talk a little bit about have you seen the students we have now? The motivation of these students. I know I'm biased because ODU, we have a great subset of students, but this generation is something. And I think that everyone probably says that about the next generation, I'm sure. But I truly do feel that way, and I think getting a full hour, I would get to dive a little bit into that too.
Others?
I think it's on. No, I would much rather present a panel. I love you all, but you're intimidating. It felt a lot better to do this in community. Yeah.
I think too, it helped us to draw a larger perspective of the issues of justice and to look at it through varying lenses, I think also helps us to spread the word.
And I think that Julie raises a good point if we're thinking about these issues of access and inclusion, that academia can be sometimes, again, kind of a hostile, intimidating place. And so are there ways in which we can restructure, how we do things to make them more inclusive for people? Again, I'm a little sad that I wanted to invite more people to be on this panel, but I wanted to also make sure that we had enough time to delve into the issues too. Sister Joanne.
Well, I'm just wondering about Julie's question.
Yeah.
Julie, are you presenting that there's an injustice? And especially since our core presenters are all women, that it in itself represents a higher ed injustice that women sometimes have to walk through. That came to me as I was listening to them talking. I wonder if it goes right along with our talk.
This has been a pattern in the past also. We have had panels of women most years. And I wonder how much of it feels like it's safer for Dr. Hunter maybe to do it as a panel. It's easier to say yes or, where you're coming from. So yes, it's a bigger issue.
Yeah.
And by the way, I prefer to be in the panel.
Yes. And again, I think that that's one thing to really think about when we're looking at our fields. It's interesting. I've done some research on gender in literature. My research is on the reception of works by authors, so whether people like them or don't like them. And there's some really interesting studies looking at student responses to literature, and that for a long time in literature, we emphasized a very analytical mode. You're not supposed to talk about your feelings about books, because that's not data. But yet many stereotypically, there are many female writers, but also, many male writers too who don't have that analytical mode, and they might get kind of pushed out of the field. And so that was really interesting for me to read, and I've really changed the way that I teach, and I do try to encourage students to just share, what did you think about this book? Did you like it? Did you not like it? And those aren't sometimes questions that we might ask. And so if we're thinking about things like feminist pedagogy is, how are we changing the way that we teach in order to be more inclusive, I think that kind of comes to mind. And that doesn't mean that the analytical modes are bad, but that it just means thinking, I think, more deeply sometimes about are some of the practices that we learned as scholars maybe not the ones we want to use in our own classrooms.
Thank you very much. It's very obvious that you put up, all of you put a lot of time and research into this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I remember the day that you told me that you'd like to do this. I was really thrilled because I knew that each one of you would put your best foot forward, and you certainly did, and it was a wonderful afternoon. And thank you for coming. And it's good to see Katie, isn't it? Yeah. And next year we will see you again at this very times, and hopefully some other people will come forward with the next topic. Thank you very, very much.